Welcome back, everyone, to The Great Retention with Camber Parker, sponsored by the YoProKnow. I'm Camber, founder and CEO of the YoProKnow, where we bring you strategies to cultivate a dynamic and multi-generational workforce. Whether you're looking to enhance cross-generational communication or secure your company's future with dedicated professionals, we've got you covered. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Jessica Sharp, founder of Sharp Brain Consulting, coming to us virtually from Houston, Texas. Dr. Sharp is a dynamic speaker who I've had the privilege of hearing multiple times, and consultant who is deeply passionate about issues of equity, inclusion, and belonging, particularly as they relate to neurobiology and the workplace. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm excited to be here.
And it's really cool because I have heard you speak multiple times and have just kind of seen your journey progress when you were here in Greenville still. And I just, am really proud to know you, and you've done such amazing things. So I'm really excited for the conversation that we have to plan today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. And I think the same can be said about you and YoProKnow and all of the things that you've been doing there
Thank
too.
you. I appreciate it. Well, we're going to get started with what I like to call a lightning round. So, in a few sentences or less, try to answer these next few questions. So, starting with, tell us something that is not on your resume.
Yeah, so I'll sort of condense it some to make it sort of this make it feel like it was a quick path, even though it had sort of some divergence along the way. But so I did teach for America, like lots of other folks, right after college, and learned really what it looked like practically to work with folks especially young people, whose lives were really hard outside of just sort of being a student and coming to school. And I read a book when I was teaching called Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Eric Jensen. And it sort of like put me on this whole different path of really wanting to learn more about what it looked like sort of from a brain perspective for folks to live in poverty. I sort of fast forward, I moved back to Greenville. I worked with young people primarily at the Y, and then just sort of kept learning. And then the way that sort of made a pathway, I think, in some ways to empathy is I was kept learning more about the brain, all that sort of stuff. And then I did a TEDx talk in Greenville, and Deb Sofield, who was our speaking coach, who was amazing.
She's mine too.
She was sort of helping me with the talk. And then all of a sudden we landed on this thing of let's talk about empathy. And it was the first time I ever really thought about it and talked about it. And then I kept learning more about empathy. I kept learning more about leadership. I got a doctorate in leadership psychology with an emphasis in neuroscience. And so I just kept learning more and more about the brain. How does sort of we show up in spaces because of what's happening in our brain, and how does all of that tie to leadership? And so it was a lot of like falling into things and saying, I think I'm really interested in this. But yeah, I sort of just fell in love with the brain and with leadership.
That's really amazing. And I just love hearing about people's journeys and trajectories and how it changes, right? Based on single moments and experiences. And so going back to that TEDx in Greenville, like that was a pivotal moment, it sounds like, because you spoke on this topic, and here you are, however many years later, going through that. And I love Deb, so I'm glad that you gave her a shout out. She's so great. All right. Would love to pivot a little bit and discuss something that we've been exploring a lot on this podcast, and just the general work that we do, which is belonging culture in the workplace, especially across different generations. So you have spoken extensively about the importance of creating environments where everyone feels like they belong. Could you share your thoughts on how belonging impacts employees, particularly in multi-generational workforces?
Yeah, so I do spend a lot of time talking about belonging, and I know it's sort of a trendier thing now, but I think that words are important, definitions are important. So for me, when I talk about belonging, what I mean is the human need to be seen, heard, and valued for your authentic and true self. Right. I think a lot of workplaces would like for us to show up as one specific way and leave all of our emotions, leave all of our sort of our junk, all of our stuff outside of the walls of the workplace. But that's not realistic, because we are humans showing up fully as ourselves all of the time. And so in terms of belonging in the workplace, it is actually the thing that allows workplaces to thrive. Right. It is the thing that can help employees feel safe. It is the thing that can make them feel like I am able to contribute and contribute as my full self, right? I don't think that any leader wants to hire an employee and then say, I only want you to contribute 20% of what you're able to contribute, right? But when we ask people to hide parts of who they are, right? Or we exclude people, we other people, we don't involve them in things, we don't communicate with them, That's basically saying the same thing. I don't want you to fully show up, which means I'm not going to get your full sort of your best. So I think we really need to continue to prioritize belonging as sort of a fundamental aspect of culture in workplaces and really a core focus of any leader.
Mm. I think that's very critical, and I'm glad that we're starting strong. Thank you for explaining that. I think to your point, words are important, right? So really defining what that sense of belonging actually means is pretty important. So I'm glad that you touched on that. There has been a growing focus recently on mental health support in the workplace, especially as a trend within Gen Z employees. I think just because the conversation is forced now, like people are not allowing people to not talk about it, which I think is really positive. But can you discuss how a sense of belonging can contribute positively to mental health? And I think what your first answer really kind of started that talking point, but would love to hear your thoughts on that, particularly as we see this younger generation who really is saying we have to talk about this.
Yeah, I will say I'm really happy, I guess is the right word, that we are talking about mental health more in the workplace. And I do think you're right. A lot of it is Gen Z sort of saying, we know that mental health is equally as important as physical health. We understand that particularly their generation, but really I would say across the board, a lot of folks are struggling, and so I appreciate that we're bringing it into the workplace, and they are really quite tied. So when we don't feel like we belong, right? When we feel othered, when we feel excluded, when we feel like we are sort of almost like, that movie, like baby has been put in the corner, right? When that happens, it makes us not feel safe. And the brain has to feel safe to do really anything productive. And what's important to note about the brain and safety is that the brain understands emotional and psychological safety, which is a trendy word in the workplace because it's important. Those sort of aspects of safety, we interpret it very similarly to physical safety, right? So safety is really, really important. And if I don't feel safe at work, of course, it's going to impact my mental health. Of course, I'm going to feel more anxious. Of course, I might be more likely to feel depressed, right? If I'm, not feeling like I can show up as myself, if I've got to, hide parts of myself, if I feel continuously ignored and not seen, that absolutely has a negative impact on mental health. And so, sort of in some ways, the reverse is true, right?
Hmm.
If I'm showing up at work, and even if I'm carrying a lot of stuff, if, again, I'm anxious or I'm battling depression or I'm, living with some really heavy things, if I'm able to come to work and again be seen and heard and valued and be able to show up fully as myself, it's not going to fix everything, right? It's not going to make me less anxious, right? But it makes it a little bit easier to continue to function in the workplace and to carry all of those other things. So they certainly have a really, really important relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like just at the end of the day, a lot of people just they want to belong, right? They if they're coming to work and spending, whatever the percentage of time is that we spend at life across our lifetime, at work across our lifetime, it's significant. So going back several years where it really was you have to come in to and be a certain way, and then it's like go home and you can be your full self again. I think that's such an important shift that's happened. But to your point earlier, it's not happening everywhere, right? People still don't feel like they can
Mhm.
come in their full selves, their full authentic selves. And so, what would you say to the organizations and leaders who might be listening or watching the show right now with that mindset still in place?
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of go back to something that you said, sort of in the question, is everybody wants to belong, right? And in theory, we know that if you watch a lot of TV, if you watch movies, a lot of times, especially if you're like me and you're paying attention to them from a belonging perspective, a lot of times folks underneath what they want is to belong. They want to be a part of a group, right? And it is actually a biological function, right? Brene Brown talks about this quite often. But as human beings, when we come to the world, we have a biological in our bones need to belong, right? And you cannot take it away. You can't say, oh, I only need to belong in one area of my life. That's not real. The other thing that's sort of important for leaders to know is that as the world has changed and evolved, people have fewer spaces where they feel like they belong, right? And I won't go too much into it, but things like church membership is down, has been for a while. Involvement in civic organizations like a Rotary, like a junior league, those things are down, right? Folks are busier. COVID has, I think, impacted us in a lot of ways. And one of them is that folks want to do less, right? And so they're more likely to be at home because they're tired, they're overwhelmed. And so I say all of that to say we have a biological need to belong, right? I would argue in a divisive world that need is even bigger, and we have fewer places where we belong. And so, as a leader of an organization, in some ways, you don't have a choice, but to think about and prioritize what does it mean to create a culture where everybody can belong? Because if you don't have it, your employees will not feel safe.
Yep.
And the behaviors that they will start exhibiting when they don't feel safe is everything from withdrawing, right? Taking more sick days, not coming to work. It can also show up as things like acting inconsistent with the organization's values, right? Not including people, just engaging in behaviors that are not productive to the workplace. So even if you're like, oh, I don't feel like dealing with my employees as whole people, you actually don't really have a choice.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful statement. But questions that leaders need to be asking themselves after listening to this is, what does it mean to have a culture where everyone belongs? That's what I'm hearing. And I think it's really fascinating to hear that there are fewer spaces where people feel like they can belong. And all of the points that you made make complete sense, but all the more reason that work needs to be a place that is
Mhm.
creating a culture of belonging. So I think that's a really great point. In your work, have you noticed any specific generational differences in how people perceive belonging or how they prefer to connect with their colleagues?
Yeah, so I think there are some differences in how belonging is perceived, right? I find, and not sort of 100%. I always like to sort of have this caveat, like I don't want to say 100% of people in this
Hmm.
one age group think this, but in
Right.
my experience as a speaker, as a consultant, as somebody who is constantly reading about belonging and what is the latest thing. I think there's some differences in perception. I think that you do have some leaders who have been in the workplace for a longer period of time, right? Who are more of the mindset of, I don't need my employees to show up as their full selves. I don't need this idea of work life balance. I want you to come to work and do what I need you to do and then go home. And I think that sort of as you get closer to folks who are in their 30s, who are in their 20s, there is a little bit of a difference of, I think that our generation was the first time when I was doing more work on generational differences and trainings. The first time I saw the term work life integration was talked about in conjunction with millennials, and we want a whole life that allows us to go volunteer, come back to work, do this, sort of have a whole life.
Hmm.
And so I think that that sort of a shift a little bit in perception is what does it mean to belong, and do we need that? But interestingly enough, I think that there's some minor differences in the way it shows up, right? So I think I sometimes see, again, sometimes younger folks, 20s, 30s, who they're more likely to be on teams, like building relationships essentially with their coworkers. They might be texting, right? They might be more likely to go to a drink after work. And then I'm seeing, sort of more generally across the board things like let's go to lunch. Right. Let's go to coffee. Those things are sort of across the
Hmm.
board. But I say that to say the differences in how it's happening is very much so nuanced. And I think it's more related to technology and our relationship with one particular tool.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, I find that most folks are doing very similar things to create connection. And I'll say one more thing about this
Mhm.
because I think it's important. One of the things that Brene Brown says is that trust is built in small moments. That is these small moments that help us build trust. And I think in many ways, connection and safety are the same, right? It is in these small moments that we have an opportunity to really see our coworkers, to really see our employees, right? And to say things like, "How was your weekend?" and pause and listen to the answer, right? And remember things and say, "Oh, I remember that your daughter got engaged. How is that going?" Right?
Mhm.
Those little moments that actually don't take a whole lot from us, those are the things that really cultivate belonging for the long term.
Yeah, and build rapport, which can have significant impacts on the business, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
so much more than just how it's going to impact the business, but it impacts the culture. And so I think that
Yeah.
I love hearing your perspective on generations having, having a role. Like you've spoken on this, you've researched this, and so it's really great to have that perspective. One question that I've really been just excited to ask, but a little nervous because of just how much it's in the news today, is, DE&I efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging efforts. We're seeing across the media now, a lot of large organizations are kind of stepping back from that. And so, DEI is something that most people know. I feel that the B was added, the belonging component was added, within the last couple of years. I'm not sure
Yeah.
exactly when, but how, like, from your perspective as somebody who studies belonging and like looks at this aspect. Can you talk about that from, just your perspective and what you're seeing? Because I feel like it's every other week in the last couple of months that we're seeing these major corporations putting out news that they're no longer going to be investing in this. So how critical is this for the workforce?
Yeah, so I'm actually really glad you asked that question. And I will try my hardest to be very brief in this answer. So to sort of to add to the context that you provided for us, Amber. So I would say probably 5 to 6 years ago, we started seeing the most progressive organizations doing DEI work adding the B. And then sort of over time, we saw more organizations adding B. Some have added A, accessibility.
Hmm.
And so partly for those reasons is sort of the first piece of why it is so troublesome that DEI is sort of being attacked. So I am in Houston, I'm in Texas. I'm still in many ways a South Carolina girly, but I live in Houston, and so I'm living in a place where. If you are in a lot of places, including a college campus, you better not talk about diversity and inclusion, right? But here's what's troublesome about that, especially for corporations who have the capacity to lead, right? They have the capacity to be 2 or 3 steps above organizations like nonprofits. The world actually is diverse, period. Right? There is no question about it. It is not when we get diverse, it just is. Now, I have the luxury of living in literally the most diverse city in the United States. So I see it. I can't go anywhere without seeing just such a richness of difference.
Mhm.
But diversity is actually about difference. So, you talk so much about generations and have for as long as I've known you. That is a aspect of diversity, right?
Yeah.
Accessibility is an aspect of diversity, right? I know that for sure. Gen Z, they are more, and I'm happy that they are more sort of open, and a little bit of millennials too, about things like ADHD, autism. Those things are aspects of diversity. So I won't sort of go too much more, but I say all of that to say diversity is here, and to ignore it is it's irresponsible.
Yep.
And the other thing that I'll say, sort of adding on, because I think that really the diversity piece is what has been politicized. And what we've been saying, that there's been this sort of argument of, well, we don't want to acknowledge difference. If we acknowledge it, that means that we are inherently saying some groups are better or worse. And that's not what we're saying. What equity has always been about is about leveling the playing field. I have for my whole career worked with young people who the situation in which they are born is tricky, right? For so many reasons. And it would be irresponsible of us to treat them the exact same way as young people who are born into families where financially it's a whole different ballgame, right? And so, again, sort of saying all that to say, if we want to create a world where everyone can thrive and everyone who is different can thrive, we have to care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, I told you a little bit ago, belonging is an inherent need of humans. So as long as you continue to have a workplace where folks are expected to come to work and engage, you have to think about belonging, because their brains are constantly looking around the environment to say, am I safe here? And if I'm somebody who fits into a diversity category, if you will, I'm air quoting on purpose, right? I am a Black woman who is neurodivergent and who's queer. So I fit in a whole bunch of categories, and I'm a millennial. So I fit in a bunch of categories. If I go into a workplace and no one looks like me, you haven't considered me, you haven't thought about me, you don't communicate with me and mine, how successful do you think I can be? And how long do you think I will stay? And then we have turnover costs, right? Which absolutely impact the business. So it was sort of a long answer to say,
That's great.
It is irresponsible of us not to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, in particular corporations who have the capacity to break the rules, because sometimes they created them.
Yeah. I mean, what a fantastic answer. I'm so glad that I knew that you could handle that curveball of a question, because I know that we didn't send it your way beforehand. But how can we have a conversation about belonging when this is happening in our country right now? And, diversity is here, right? It's been here, but it is here. And I'm upset that the B and the A were just kind of added on in the last 5-6 years, and now and corporations started investing in more DE&I directors and C-suite level, only to have it reversed within 5 to 6 years. That's upsetting to me.
It is. It really is. And I remember in 2020, right, when many of us were at home and we watched the murder of George Floyd. I remember, because I was there, right? Diversity practitioners, our phones were ringing off the hook, right? That was actually when I went out full time. I was like, I think I have the capacity to get enough business to be out full time. And even then, we were all worried, and we said, oh, like this is great now, but will this be able to be sustainable? And the last thing I'll say about this maybe is that I recognize that a lot of things are political in nature because politics sort of is underneath a lot of what we do in our world. But this doesn't actually have to be political. And to me, it doesn't matter who you vote for. You should be able to engage in initiatives and priorities and practices that allow everyone to show up as themselves, especially in a workplace. Because if you don't, again, there are a lot of actual consequences, both to the people who are working there, but also to your bottom line.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. Thank you for answering that. In the past, you have talked about overcoming implicit bias. What are some practical strategies that team members of all generations might use to identify and mitigate implicit bias, especially as it relates to other generations in the workplace, in order to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed? Wow, that was a long winded question. I apologize.
Well, and it actually goes really quite well with this
It
idea of
does.
DEI.
Mhm.
So I'll do this thing that I always do where I'm teaching people, even answering questions. So I will, again, very quickly talk about bias. Bias is a DEI sort of theme and topic for a lot of reasons, but at its very actual core, it's a brain function, right? And I know a lot of people who are reluctant to talk about bias because they say things like, well, if I have biases, it must mean I'm a bad person. And what I always say is that if you have biases, it means that your brain is actually functioning exactly like it is supposed to,
Mhm.
right? Biases, and I won't go into it, but they have a lot of actual like neurobiological functions.
Mhm.
The problem comes in when we allow bias to go unchecked and when we allow bias to impact our communication, our decision making. That's the problem. And so there are a few sort of quick things that I'll share about what to do about bias. But the very first and foremost is acknowledging that bias is a thing that happens and becoming aware of what your biases are as an individual, right? The Harvard Implicit Association Test is a great tool. You can just Google Harvard IAT, you could Google Harvard Bias Test. They'll take your email. It's just for coding purposes. To my knowledge, I don't get emails from them from that. You go through an assessment and it will tell you what your preferences are, which then can help you understand, do I have, what's the opposite of that, right? And again, that just helps you to have this knowledge to then move forward. And then once you have that knowledge, what I recommend is as an individual, really leaning into things like empathy, which I think we'll talk about in a second, but also trying to what I always talk about, diversify your life, right?
Mhm.
So you're basically teaching your brain to slow down when it's making decisions and teaching your brain this group of people who I may not have spent a lot of time with, they are not all bad, right? And your brain doesn't necessarily think they're bad, but for the sort of the function of this conversation, it's easier to sort of use those sort of words
Mhm.
like good or bad. From a workplace perspective, we have to slow down our decision making some, and not so much, right, that we're like, analysis paralysis,
Mhm.
but a lot of times we're making decisions fast. Slow them down just a bit. Make sure that the people who are making decisions, really, especially related to like HR decisions, big organizational decisions,
Mhm.
that the table is diverse, right? And that you've created a space where people can share, because I have my own biases, right? Camber, you have your own.
Mhm.
But if we're at a table with a bunch of people and we have different biases, one individual bias or a collective, one or two people having the same one, won't pop up and decide where we go, because
Mhm.
everybody is able to sort of level that playing field.
Mm.
And then the last thing that I'll say that I sometimes recommend to organizations is, again, for your decision making in particular, try to blend in some qualitative and quantitative. So if you're hiring, right, try to have some version of a rubric that allows you to have some numbers on a page in addition to let's talk about or let's write down the words of what we're thinking. So that way, again, it just sort of helps to create that even playing field and just get bias out of the way so that we can be making the best decisions possible and not decisions rooted from our own sort of predated knowledge or opinion
Mhm.
about somebody or a group of people.
Yeah, wow. That's thank you for I love that you take that approach when you're answering questions because it's helpful. I mean, the what you're talking about is so important and impactful to organizations and beyond and just like how we are and operate in our day-to-day lives, right? Outside of work. So hearing some of these descriptions and kind of expanding on that really is helpful for me. And I also love some of the tools that you gave, which kind of goes into my next question as we kind of look at the time and wrap up here. Can you share some examples of how some of our listeners and leaders can turn empathy into action, particularly while they're fostering belonging? I think you've shared so many tools already today, but is there anything else that you would like leaders who are listening and watching to know before we go?
Yeah, I mean, really, the last thing I'll say is I talked about slowing down, right? But at the very core, empathy is about two things, and I'll sort of try to say this briefly. That empathy is about perspective taking and about connecting to emotion. And so that idea of perspective taking, I won't ever fully understand somebody's experience who is fully different from me, right? Like, as a very concrete example, I'm not a parent. So I don't actually know what it is like to be a parent. But there are things within that that I can connect to, right? I can connect to caring about a child, right? I can connect to being anxious about a person you care about, right? So, sort of, it's about perspective taking, which as a leader, the way to do that is to sort of stop and say, I wonder what it would be like to have this thing happen, right?
Mhm.
And again, you're not going to ever sort of fully understand, but trying to shift that perspective. The other piece around empathy is a connecting to emotion. And I think that this actually might be the harder thing is, in my experience and from what the research says, in order to best connect to emotions in others, you have to connect to your own emotions. Right. So it goes back to one of the very first things I said is about self love. So for me, part of what I do to show up well, I lead a lot of people primarily from a volunteer perspective. And I try to make sure that, like, I am connecting with myself, that I'm able to say, oh, I feel really sad right now, or I feel really angry, I feel really happy right now. So that I'm constantly connecting to my emotions. So when they call me, right, when I have a volunteer call me and I can tell that their voice is different, I can say, oh, it sounds like you're anxious. Let's sort of slow down for just a second and connect to that. So again, it's about being able to connect to someone's perspective, but it's also the harder work of connecting to yourself and connecting to your emotions to make it easier for you to connect.
Very impactful tools, again, that you've shared throughout this entire episode. And I always like to kind of share with the listeners and the watchers of our show today, everything that we've talked about today is doable in the workplace, right? You can actively apply it. It's going to take time, right? That's the
Mhm.
component. And it takes a collective interest and effort on the leadership, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's the piece I keep thinking back to. You could have people who are entry level with this mindset, but at the end of the day, if it's not a part of the culture and it's not coming from the top down, it's really hard to see that change happen. Would you
Mhm.
agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We need to make sure that everybody in the organization, but again, primarily those leading the culture, leading what we're doing, that they are focused. And what you said is so important. I'm never giving people things that are really hard to do, right? What I always tell folks is that it takes intention and saying, this is something that I'm going to prioritize, and then just a few consistent actions. It doesn't take you a long time to, as you're walking past your employee's desk, to say, how are things? And
Right.
stop and
Right.
listen and then move on. An extra minute, 2 minutes,
Right.
right? So combine it with intention, you can make a real positive impact on your culture.
Yeah, what a great way to wrap up this episode, Jessica. Thank you so much for your time today. I think we could keep going for hours at this point. But anything else that you want to share before we wrap up?
The very, very last thing I'll say is something I've already said is as a leader, it's my belief, my strong belief, that one of the best things that you can do for your employees is to know yourself, love yourself, and show up from that place first.
Absolutely. Jessica, thank you again. Before we wrap up today, I always like to share a couple of key notes and just key takeaways from an episode. And I think it will be no surprise that the ones that I feel are just so relevant today is, leaders, what does it mean to have a culture where everyone belongs? What does that look like for you? What does it look like for your team to feel seen, heard, and valued for being their authentic selves? Fewer spaces where our community, our world feels like they belong, right? How can work be a place where people feel safe and they belong? I love your take on that, Jessica. And then last but not least, diversity is here. To ignore it is to be irresponsible. Right. So we will leave you with that. Thank you again for joining us today. For our listeners who want to learn more about Dr. Sharp's work, you can visit her website at sharpbrainconsulting.com, which we'll also put in our show notes. And before you go, remember this: the generational landscape is shifting, and the workforce as we know it is not the same workplace that we once knew. Our mission is to help you save time and money by identifying these shifts and demystify generational differences through our training, consulting, and strategy at YoProKnow. Contact us today if you're interested in transforming your multi-generational workforce. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.